to either blur your
Oh,
background.
no.
Next, we'll hear from Louise on ways in which the Amalima Loko program is addressing these factors, and then from Barbara, who will share lessons and insights from MUS programs in the region. Then we'll have a discussion session where we hope to hear from you on your own insights and experiences. And let me turn it over to Jessica to start us off. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks so much, Jude. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening here in Stockholm, if you're coming to us live in Stockholm. As Jude and Jen noted, I'll briefly be sharing some of the findings from the research that we conducted across 13 sites in Zimbabwe that were implementing MUS, multiple use water services or systems, as part of these two USAID-supported regional food security activities, Takunda and Amalima Loko. And the objective of this research was really to identify innovative and context-specific strategies for MUS planning, design, operation, and sustainability, and then to derive practical lessons that could be scaled up throughout Zimbabwe, but also potentially replicated in other countries. Next, please. Before I jump into those findings, I kind of wanted to take a brief step back and provide a bit of context around how we as a project defined MUS and the dimensions of sustainability that we focused on. Ideally, MUS describes an inclusive and participatory approach to water services development and implementation that takes the diverse domestic and productive water uses and the related needs of communities as the starting point for planning, designing, and managing investments in water services. And by taking this more integrated approach, it's really possible to make more cost-effective and sustainable decisions around water services that can also generate a broader range of health and livelihood benefits than are usually derived from single-use systems. So broadly speaking, we've seen two major modalities that have been used to enable the wash and the irrigation subsectors both to move beyond their single-use mandate. And these are the domestic plus approaches to allow households to use what has been domestic water to expand on that water availability or infrastructure for livestock, horticulture, or other livelihoods uses. Or on the flip side, irrigation or productive plus approaches that start with irrigation or livestock watering and then add facilities for domestic or other uses. But over time, experiences have really shown that more purposeful engagement and community-driven MUS that really involves communities from the very early planning stages and consistently throughout the process, and lets them really take the lead on the process, and often builds on self-supply, where communities have often invested already in the absence of public services. And that these have demonstrated higher levels overall of technical, financial, and institutional sustainability. And so we really tried to focus on how to facilitate these community-driven approaches to the extent possible. Next, please. It's also important to note that and recognize that MUS requires an enabling environment and support at multiple levels of governance. And so this research focused not only on community level interventions, but also on the national institutional frameworks, the national policies, and the national legislation necessary to provide a mandate for MUS and to overcome the really common issue of institutional and legal fragmentation across subsectors. But we also focused in at what we called the intermediate level. And in Zimbabwe, we're really talking about the provincial and district level government institutions and their civil society or NGO partners that have the real mandate for service delivery. So really, we tried to look across these levels to see where effective partnerships can be strengthened and what the relative capacities and gaps were at each level. Next, please. And then finally, I promise I'll get to the findings in 1 second. The financial sustainability of MUS is obviously a critical component. You have to be able to sustain the infrastructure over time. But we also recognize that there are diverse and really critical non-financial benefits of MUS that reinforce each other over time to promote poverty alleviation in very real ways. And these can include, improved water and food security, which have multiplier effects where people are healthier and consequently experience increased productivity. Livelihood sustainability, livelihoods diversification, improved income opportunities, And this often leads to increased resilience in the face of climate and other shocks and stressors. Improved functioning of local water management and service institutions. And we saw in Zimbabwe increased technical capacity and community cohesion coming out of these projects, where the community was really, in the driver's seat. And again, while this is not a comprehensive list of the potential benefits, I do want to flag the improved gender equity and inclusiveness, both by ensuring inclusion of women and girls in decision-making and in moose governance, but also by freeing time to pursue income generating activities and disrupting the sort of intergenerational poverty cycles that come from girls missing school for water-related reasons. Next, please. So our overarching research objectives were to uncover the factors at all these different levels, at the community level, the intermediate, and the national level, that are impacting the viability, the sustainability, and equitable outcomes for moose in Zimbabwe, and develop some practical recommendations for all the stakeholders. And in terms of sustainability, we really tried to unpack factors around financial sustainability, but also around technical and infrastructure, around resource sustainability. So we looked at water quality at each of the sites, and then really focusing in on institutional and organizational factors at both the community and multiple levels of government that are really critical to the design, implementation, and sustainability of moose, and the types of partnerships that are necessary across these different actors to overcome the challenges that we identified. Next. So the first set of findings really talks about the enabling governance environment of moose, the legal and institutional frameworks across the wash and irrigation subsectors. And sort of the underlying fundamental challenge is that there is no explicit policy or legal framework that governs moose in Zimbabwe. Instead, the water governance framework is spread across multiple different laws, multiple different institutions at different levels of government. And there's not a lot of coherence and coordination. And so this results in kind of the critical baseline challenge of fragmentation across water subsectors, legally, institutionally, but also importantly in the relevant finance streams that come from that. There are institutional mechanisms to facilitate coordination at the provincial and district levels, at that intermediate level, but these are really challenged by this lack of regulatory framework to clarify the multiple overlapping mandates that currently exist. And to compound that, there's an ongoing reorganization of the irrigation sector that has kind of created additional confusion, additional mandates, and has also relocated many of the technical extension agencies that would be meaningful in moose from the district to the provincial level, so farther away from communities. And this move is a key challenge, not just because of the access, but also because of the other sort of overarching constraint of the severe financial issues that agencies have. They don't have adequate staffing. They don't have vehicles sometimes. They face technical challenges, particularly these newly created institutions. And this really undermines the ability of local government to effectively partner with communities to sustain these moose interventions. For the most part, moose in Zimbabwe continues to depend on donor investment supported by NGO implementing partners. At the community level, there's also challenges for institutions, a lack of technical and asset management capacity, severe financial constraints. We'll talk about that in a moment. But additional challenges stem from some key legal gaps. I won't go into too much detail, but it's important to kind of address one, which is the lack of clarity in the law around community-based water tenure. The current Water Act defines primary water, which is sort of the domestic water category under the Act, as including reasonable uses of water for basic domestic needs around the household or residential premises, and also for supporting homestead livestock, brickmaking, or dip tanks. But what it doesn't do is clearly define the amount of water being used for livelihoods purposes, like community gardens, would trigger the need for a permit. To obtain and pay for a permit. This is left to the discretion of catchment councils that are responsible for basin level planning. So we have a situation in which some communities are paying for permits and getting permits for their community gardens, while others are exempted from needing to do that. And in a situation where communities' income is significantly below the poverty line, which we defined as $50 per month, this can really impact livelihoods options, but also just basic household water and food security. And the onus to communities for acquiring permits is also it can be very burdensome, both administratively and financially. So there's a real need to sort of clarify legally the scope of community water tenure rights, and also to understand that where you exempt these rights and expect that category to cover all of communities' needs in most situations, they don't have any practical legal standing when it comes to other users that might threaten their water tenure security, who do have a permit, who can prove, I have this amount of water, and here's my piece of paper to prove it. So finally, under this category, Zimbabwe is sort of still in the process of operationalizing decentralization mandates for water services. And this has included some funding mechanisms down to the district level, but departments are currently still siloed, and their core mandates really require them to report to and maintain accountability up to provincial and national levels, rather than being responsible to the needs of the communities that they serve. So the incentive structure is a bit misaligned for community-driven moves. Next, please. So core around community-driven moves is community participation. And while this has been ongoing in Zimbabwe, there have been some challenges faced by the projects that we looked at that indicate a need for more consistent, in-depth engagement of communities from the very start and throughout the planning, implementation, and post-construction phases, that sort of the handover to the sustaining beyond of these moose projects. And this has really been recognized and taken on board by the regional food security activities, and they're including community visioning processes as an integral component of their planning. And this will be described in much more detail by my colleague Louise Nkomo in a moment. So there's great progress being made here. But in terms of the past, community members did express a lack of satisfaction with infrastructure choice and also location sites. And even though they were consulted during the process, there was a perception that there was sort of a predetermined solution that was being imposed from the outside in some cases. For example, drip irrigation. And the choice was very clearly made to conserve water in a very water scarce environment. But these kinds of conflicts and misunderstandings demonstrate a need to invest in more awareness raising, in more community capacity building around what their choices are, and what the trade-offs are of different infrastructure choices and siting, and to seek effective community proposed and agreed alternatives that'll be really supported and used over time. Next, please. Financing, we come back to it. This is obviously critical, but again, coming back to the local government constraints, really the inadequate financing available at that level leaves it up to the communities to be able to cover the costs of operation and maintenance over time. And while across the board, the 13 at the 13 sites, we found that people were willing to pay for increased service and increased to be able to facilitate moose. They were not able to. They just didn't have the kind of finance available to be actually able to contribute what was necessary. So the financial analysis actually showed that in order to generate enough profits to sustainably meet operation and maintenance costs, irrigation schemes would need to operate consistently at full capacity, and households would have to reinvest 10% of their profits to raise the necessary capital to cover the costs of their infrastructure. And this would take 10 years to get to the point where they were actually meeting those costs. So that's a really long time to realize your investment. And in addition, that's at full capacity, right? So water availability constraints in many of these places mean that that's just not possible over time. And these constraints emanate from climate impacts, but also from, the sort of influx land tenure issue in Zimbabwe, where you have communities resettling onto land and having to have access to new water, to existing water sources, population growth, et cetera. So there's a lot of drivers there. So there's a real need to explore alternative financing mechanisms. Again, my colleague from Amalima, Loko, Louise, will talk about some of the really terrific innovations that they're trying right now to address some of these constraints. And then finally, under this heading, communities really also expressed a willingness to switch to higher value crops, but we're really concerned because there's a lack of sufficient access to market opportunities to sell that produce. So, you can see that as a constraint, but also an opportunity to focus on market development over time to address that issue. I should sort of take a step back and say, with the community engagement constraints that we heard about, a lot of this really was due to the fact that many of those sites that we studied had started as a single use intervention and then expanded to become a multiple use services intervention. So they were already starting kind of with constraints around what they could finance, how they could finance it. And I think that's really where a lot of the community engagement limitations also came in, that where we're starting from the beginning with a moose approach, that would not happen. So it wasn't for lack of trying to engage the community. It was really because of sort of the iterative way in which those projects were developed. Okay, so finally, final slide, please. We did also sample water quality at 10 of the 13 sites. We were able to do this, and only 3 of them were shown to have potable water. These were all 3 boreholes. And talking to the Environmental Management Agency about who's responsible for monitoring water quality, there's huge capacity constraints to be able to get out into the field and to be able to do this on any kind of regular basis. So we're really needing to look at community-based solutions to monitoring and water treatment, but also at the same time recognizing that drinking water quality isn't necessarily needed for all of these uses across moose, right? We need to really think about the fact that there's a smaller amount of water that needs to be potable, and so that we can target some of these interventions specifically to the quantities needed for drinking, and that is an opportunity again, and that there are an increasing number of solutions available to do those kinds of things. So with that, I think I'm out of time. I will wrap it up, but I'm happy to answer questions towards the end, and I will hand it over to my colleagues, Louise and Barbara, to talk a little bit more about implementation in Zimbabwe and South Africa. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Jess. Next, we'll hear from Louise of the Amalima Loko RIFSA. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you so much, Jude. And greetings to you all. In my presentation, I'll share learning on how the Amalima Loko program makes use of community visioning for identifying and prioritizing community assets. I will also showcase our vacuum tank technology and innovative technology for the abstraction of water from sand rivers. And then I'll also share some reflections on MUS. So Amalima Loko program is a USAID-funded program that's designed to improve food security in Zimbabwe. The program is implemented by CNFA together with 5 partners: Davane, ORAP, IMC, the Men of Group, and Mercy Corps. Next slide. The program is implemented across 5 districts of Zimbabwe's Matabeleland North Province, and it is hydrologically within the Gwai catchment. These are the areas that are shaded green on the map. Next slide, please. So to achieve the program goal, interventions are implemented across 3 technical purposes. At the foundation of these technical areas is the community visioning process. This community visioning process, it assists communities to identify their priorities, their capacities, and their development challenges. It then also enables communities to use this knowledge to define their solutions and actions to address their needs. So the CV process, it allows for inclusive and meaningful participation of women, as already alluded to by Jess in her presentation, men and youth who come together with their local leaders from the planning and implementation stages through to the sustaining stages, which is fundamental for MUS sustainability. Next slide. This next slide is an illustration of how the CV process is used to help communities to initiate collaboration, to diagnose their challenges, and to envision their solutions, and finally develop their transformation plans. It starts, as you can see with the maps above, with the process of community mapping. Here, communities develop a shared understanding of their risks, their assets, and their capacities. From this, they then engage in a process of ground truthing, that is to physically verify and triangulate their information as agreed upon during the community dialogues. They then refine their maps, leading to a process of prioritizing actions and activities to meet these challenges. This results in the development of village action plans that are consolidated into ward transformation plans. And at the catchment level, these become the watershed action plans. And from these, communities share their plans with local government and development partners such as ourselves as a resource mobilization strategy. They also use these plans to carry out and implement their own community collective actions. Next slide. So as a program, we are using the community visioning to design our interventions. For example, water scarcity was identified through community visioning as one of the main shocks affecting communities. Consider that the area in which we are working in is arid, and geologically, it mainly consists of aeolian sands that make the water source development from groundwater a challenge. Alternatives had to be found. So alluvial aquifers or sand rivers, they provide 70% of water needs, and they form the main source of water where groundwater cannot be accessed. As the program engaged with communities, the communities highlighted the need to use water from these sand rivers, not just for domestic use, but also for productive purposes, such as small-scale agriculture. Therefore, developing and designing an appropriate water abstraction for multi-use became a priority for the Amalima Loko program. Next slide, please. So the traditional or original systems of drawing water from sand rivers, these involved direct installation in the sand river. The systems encountered various vast challenges. Firstly, during flood events, the submersible pumps and the well screens were washed away or they were damaged. Over time, the manifold system would clog due to an ingress of sediment. And thirdly, the fuel to run the pumps was a challenge in terms of its accessibility, its cost, and the conflict that was arising from insufficient contributions made by users. So these challenges meant a loss of productivity, especially in systems that were connected to irrigation. Next slide, please. So in terms of innovations, next slide again. In terms of innovations or innovative technological solutions, we had to find these to address these challenges. So during the community consultations, communities advocated for systems that they themselves could operate, systems that use solar power because of the challenges that they had with fuel pumps, and also they wanted systems where they could get space locally. So to meet these requirements, the vacuum technology, which you see below in the diagram or in the presentation, is what was developed by removing the pumping system from the water and putting this on the riverbank. Previous slide, please. So pumps were easy to access at any time for maintenance. The system also uses photovoltaics or solar. As a program, we've implemented this vacuum technology at Ndonjeni community. As you can see there, the lady who's using water from Sand River for irrigation. The system is a community-led MUS. It started with the participatory diagnosis of water challenges in the area, and it serves irrigators as well as households. So it serves water for both irrigation and domestic use. At the asset level, there is a project-specific management committee. Also, this committee is embedded in the village development planning. It reports to them, and because of that, this is key and critical for MUS because these committees need to be embedded in existing structures. Also, it enjoys traditional leader support, especially for conflict resolution or endorsement of actions. At the institutional or stakeholder level, this is the enabling environment that Jess was talking about. While there are no legal frameworks governing MUS, we saw the catchment councils, the departments of the Department of Environmental Management, or what we call the environmental health, as well as the Department of Agricultural Extension, providing technical support to users. So there was a plus on that. Next slide, please. With regards to MUS financing, I see we are having a technical glitch. I will continue with my presentation. With regards to MUS financing, we find that whilst users have a willingness to pay, as demonstrated by the $1 subscription that they make on a monthly basis, this is inadequate to meet maintenance and repair costs. So what you tend to see is that in an event of a major breakdown, there is emergency mobilization of resources which takes time to gather, resulting in a prolonged system downtime. As a program, we are also promoting financing strategies. One is to encourage users to implement or contribute an initial startup payment as part of their membership for the use. We also promote subscriptions that are based on an analysis of cost breakdown for key components, so that users or communities avoid just subscribing a 50 cents or a $1 subscription fee. It has to be related to the cost of replacing components. And we're also working to link users to insurance companies for the replacement or for the financing of high value assets, such as the replacement of solar panels or the replacements of pumps. Next slide. So with regards to water quality, the water quality from alluvial aquifers or sand rivers is generally good due to the anoxic conditions in these sand rivers. However, water quality is compromised during flood events as a result of the high land surface pollutant loads. And this normally happens between the months of December and February. So to counter this, the Amalima Loko program designed specifically to counter this challenge. So we install well points within the sand river where we get minimum sediment disturbance during flooding events. And this eliminates the need for water treatment, which is expensive and usually not sustained by communities. We also encourage good environmental hygiene practices, such as the construction and use of latrines, avoiding open defecation and boiling water where possible. Next slide. So the following are some of the lessons or reflections of MUS. We acknowledge that MUS is an emerging and growing concept. We are seeing a shift away from the development of single-use systems to multi-use systems or services across the developmental fraternity. Here, Amalima Loko is establishing an MUS system in Lupani that will support a 3-hectare irrigation and provide water to a health center that caters for over 3,000 households from a sand abstraction system. We also recognize that whilst institutions to support MUS are compromised because there is no legal framework governing MUS in the country, we do get support from the government stakeholders to actually carry out these MUS or to develop these MUS services. It should be noted that the initial cost of setting up an MUS is high. It requires complex designs that have to be made simple to operate and manage by users, and this takes time and a lot of ingenuity. Also, there are challenges with regards to communally managed MUS. There is need to train and build the capacity of users to manage these systems, and of course, the need to create lasting linkages with private public sector service providers for ongoing service provision. And finally, there is a promising future for MUS. At the institutional level, efforts are being made to create an enabling environment for the implementation of multi-use services, and we commend the collaboration that we are currently seeing between development partners and government stakeholders and line ministries in implementing these services. We are pushing and continuing to push for a framework for MUS in the country. Also, I've already alluded to the steps taken by development partners such as ourselves and the support that we're also getting from government and funding partners in setting up this MUS. And lastly, through processes such as community visioning, communities themselves begin to own the development process. They own their water infrastructure. They become accountable for their own assets. They engage in inclusive dialogue where everyone is participating, and therefore that results in access to water for all. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. And now we'll hear from Barbara at the International Water Management Institute. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Jude, and hi to everyone. And thanks for this opportunity to basically echo what has already been told with another example from South Africa. Next slide, please. And This is a project supported by the Africa Water Facility and implemented by the Water Research Commission, an NGO and IWMI, but also very much with government, the different government departments, and then 6 communities in Limpopo province, a poor, rural, low-income rural area, where we see that the government at the highest levels already realizes basically people have multiple needs, both domestic and productive. A lot is already happening. Basically, on the ground, communities are implementing IWM. It is both the infrastructure, the resource, and the use, etc. So this was a project where we were able to show demonstrated on the ground. Next slide, please. Where we applied the famous project cycle, echoing again what Louise also mentioned. You start, there are structures, you do the diagnosis first, what is already happening on the ground, and what are the priorities that come up, and that's where you then find this finance from outside, and technical advice, institutional advice, you implement and you go on. So in our project, next slide please, we found that in the diagnosis, but it's a no-brainer in a sense, people use the water for multiple uses, but also at multiple sites. We realized that homesteads and fields around the homesteads are really prime sites for use, which is the target of the domestic water sector very much, and it is a priority for people themselves as well, but not for luxury uses, domestic uses. As we found irrigation livestock, but irrigation is already practiced by quite a proportion of the people. When it is a distant field, it may be a single-use system, but there are also other sites of use, direct use of the streams for fisheries or laundry, etc. And related to that, most infrastructure is multi-purpose at the same time. Importantly, people already have multiple sources as well. Around homesteads, almost everybody uses, combines the different sources, surface, groundwater sources, then also during the dry period, people adjust, etc. And then self-supply. I will give some more examples of that as well. Yes, next please. Because we know a lot about pumps, of course, for groundwater, but we found in Chakuma, one of the villages, where the 12 sections of that village came together, each section, to put a joint collective gravity system together. So wherever the government is still busy or will never reach the low-income rural areas, people have to find solutions as well. And we build on that in the multiple use services. Next slide, please. So I don't need to be long on that. In South Africa, we also did the visioning that the people come with the solutions. Where should if they prioritize a tap, where should a communal tap, where should the tap be put, etc. Next, I go quickly over that. Next slide. Same for construction. People learn with technical advice. They learn how to join pipes, where the pipes are, what is the cause of leakages, etc. Next slide. Because then we go to the to further really measure the impacts as well. In 2 communities we did that, also showing again that in the one community there was already an NGO supported system that was suboptimally used. So there you get the whole issue of refurbishment, maintenance, and organization around it. And in another village there was a borehole, but there was no recirculation as yet. So there the priority of the community was to get the the reticulation of an existing borehole. So it depends on the local situation. Yes, please. Next. But if you look generally, again, no need to look at all the figures, just to the red percentages. We see that the water volumes really increased a lot, 78%, 90%, much shorter time to get water, even with communal taps. The uses remained multiple, but the benefits in terms of economic value of the productive uses, mainly around homesteads, that increased to 60% and 76%. And interestingly, we found that it's mainly the women who managed the productive uses as well. So in this case, the irrigation. Next slide, please. So to summarize the benefits of MOES, multiple use services, community-led interventions. It's cost effective because we mobilize what is already there. The many community resources that are there, the self-supply, the notion of a multi-purpose infrastructure. We know it's very well for big dams. Of course, you design for as many uses as possible, and that also happens. It already happens on the ground anyhow, and it is much cheaper than having one domestic system, one irrigation system, and one system for livestock. Of course, the community ownership means that there is 24/7 availability and incentives of the community to repair something that should be done quickly. And we even found last of the 4 bullet points of the cost effectiveness that if you could really get your materials, procure your materials more locally, if you don't have to get through the very expensive centralized national procurement procedures, it can be cheaper as well. In this project, we did give small stipends to the people who worked. So it merged very well with the employment generation type of projects. And in the end, the community says, we worked hard for it, we own it, and there is a place to go. And one of the members, she just said, MOES of the community-led service delivery enables communities to do whatever they can do, and which is often easiest and simplest for government anyhow. And last slide, next slide, please. This is the last one, which is just to highlight, not from this project, but just to highlight again how diverse the multiple use services can be. And that is what we see internationally, the Rural Water Supply Network, the MOES Group, smart centers. They have worked a lot on MOES, coming from the individual of the household level, individual infrastructure, where we interestingly see that the wash sector, where self-supply is also getting much more profile, and on the other hand, the irrigation sector, if you now talks about farmer-led irrigation development, they talk about the same technologies, especially when you climb the water ladder. And just to mention the importance then of the smaller scale, the affordable technologies, the row pump, etc. They make irrigation, even irrigation also accessible for the poorer households. So really for everyone. So the universality of wash, everybody should have access to water. In any case, productive uses is augmented, but in low-income rural areas, there's also livestock, there's also irrigation, there's small-scale enterprise, and we need to expand or come together, basically, the domestic and productive uses. And lastly, as Jessica also mentioned, for drinking water, absolutely, but you need 3 liters and not everything, and there are solutions for like water filters. Which if you need to clean at all. Thank you for your attention.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Barbara, and to all the presenters for these really fantastic presentations and rich insights. We'd like to pause here and take a couple of questions from the audience, and we've seen some really compelling questions come through on the Google Docs, so I think we'll start there. One of the first questions is wondering about the water available in a multi-use system, and that it may not be large enough to meet diverse water requirements of all the users and for all the different uses, and what criterion is adopted to allocate available water between different users and different uses. That came from Ravinder Malik. Thank you so much for that great question. And we can shift the view so we can see everybody in our group maybe. But would any of our presenters like to take that? Barbara, go ahead, please. Yes, thanks.
That's an excellent question. And from the domestic water sector's perspective, where we talk about 25, 50, 100 liters per person per day, irrigation is more. Livestock needs more water. But from the irrigation sector, they say, oh, domestic users, that is negligible in terms of volumes. So it really boils down to what communities want, and as Jess also already mentioned, include the most marginalized people in your visioning process and get their priorities as number one. So the marginalized women and marginalized men, but certainly the women, include them in your visioning process so that you get their priorities. On the water is remains scarce. Thank you.
Jess, go ahead. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I would just say that there's also a role for a couple of things. First, I mean, in Zimbabwe, there were many different communities that had created their own set of rules around allocation and reallocation. And you know, were very inclusive, actually, in terms of the whole community kind of sitting down and figuring out, you know, in these times of shortages, how are we cutting it? Are we going to irrigate in the evening so we don't lose water to evaporation? You know, how do we include the elderly? Sort of, they made those decisions on their own and came up with an allocation plan for water shortages. There's also, you know, not just within the Zimbabwean context, because as we keep saying, there is no legal framework. And one of the issues with that is it's a catchment by catchment approach to prioritization of different uses and allocation for different uses that isn't linked to moose implementation. So that's kind of another misalignment wherein, you know, some places there will be actual national enunciation of what are the kind of, you know, priorities for use over time and reallocation during times of shortage that can provide guidance to communities and their partners. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jess. Louise or Evaristo, if you have anything, do you have anything you would like to add just from your own experiences on this question of sort of accounting for multiple uses, multiple users?
Sure, just to respond on that, I'm echoing the words of Barbara and Jess on this. Another dimension of this really is to say, what was the infrastructure designed for in the beginning? And this is what determines water allocation. So you would find that if the infrastructure, for example, is a hand pump from a borehole system, immediately you would understand that this is designed for domestic use, for household drinking, and maybe for watering livestock. This would be more small livestock. If it is a dam, particularly, it is mainly designed maybe perhaps for irrigation and for livestock drinking, but you will find that the users will always make the water point or the water resource a multiple use system. They will use the water for multiple purposes. Then allocation then becomes dependent upon what is the situation or the context at the time. So what we've seen some experiences is that if the dam was designed, perhaps say, for example, for irrigation and livestock watering, if perhaps there's a drought here and you're seeing the water levels in the dam go down, you will find that the decision makers or the people who will make a decision to say what is the water going to be used for, especially in areas where water is for livestock, will be the men. And then they'll say those who are irrigating, and it's mainly women, stop the irrigation activities and we continue and we use the little water that's available for livestock drinking. So these are the dynamics that happen in various communities. So allocation will also be context specific at a given time, despite the fact that the system is used for multiple services or multiple purposes. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Louise. We had another question sort of related or maybe easily segueing from this one. There were two questions, one from Matt and one from Runyoraro, around sort of groundwater uses. So Matt's question was, did the community visioning plans include managing for both surface and groundwater uses? And if so, how did that figure into the MUSE interventions? And Runyoraro is saying also, given that MUSE is a growing concept with potential to attract increased adoption, do you have plans to also consider groundwater monitoring as a sustainability strategy? Just those two sort of fit together in my mind and are kind of related to this question of multiple uses and stronger demand on those water resources. Do any of our presenters want to take that one first? I'm sure everyone has thoughts on that.
Okay, so I'll just share my thoughts on the last part, which reflects around the issues to do with groundwater monitoring. So in our situation and context in Zimbabwe, groundwater monitoring perhaps becomes the mandate of the water authority, and the subcatchment councils would normally do this. It's easier for them to monitor surface water levels than groundwater levels. So again, we have resource challenges in monitoring groundwater. Communities themselves can do it at a smaller scale using their own borehole and also just checking the nearest borehole in terms of monitoring groundwater. But at a larger scale, this is very difficult for us to do currently, even in the programs that we are doing. Thank you.
Barbara, Jess, or yeah, Barbara, go ahead, please.
I think the issue of groundwater really makes clear what the inequities in the water use are, because what happens is that the people with the deeper boreholes, they suck the more shallow wells dry, and as Jess says, the communities know I showed a picture of the shallow well that was the main source of water in one of the villages. They are very careful about deeper boring equipment, because they know that things can happen with a river snake, and so there is this understanding about how the water table behaves, and it really puts the question on the table. The people who can't afford the deeper infrastructure, are they going to affect the others? So the community-based water tenure, and we have examples in India, for example, that communities do sit together and try to, especially the tube wells for irrigation have been massive. But communities do sit together. How should we now deal with the needs for domestic water users? Because some people can easily, if you have more infrastructure, deeper, more expensive infrastructure, you use more water. You can use more water. So the equity issue is on the table with groundwater, even more strongly than with surface water.
100%. Yeah, thanks for that both. There's a related question in the chat that I think might be a nice follow-up to. Do we think that communities can adapt with any shortages? And if yes, how to plan that allocation out? Jess, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I would just come back to that situation, that I explained earlier too. That was a real example from a community that they are adapting. They have to adapt. The adaptation question, however, doesn't mean that they're not suffering, because the women within the community were also saying we used to be able to grow many more diverse crops than we can now grow, so our income levels have dropped. We're walking farther, during certain parts of the dry season to get to a viable source of water in order to maintain, a certain service level. So, they are adapting, they're finding ways, but I think as Louise also said, and I would welcome your insights on this, Louise, too, but, there's the equity and inclusion question comes up severely because who are the decision makers? when those kinds of decisions get made, existing institutions are going to take over, sort of the, and we have found sort of across the board that while there are institutions that are assigned to different water sources for operation and maintenance and decision making around conflicts or reallocation during times of shortage, those don't really function in between times where there are problems. So the fallback goes to, as Louise said, sort of who are the usual decision makers, and are those processes actually inclusive of women and girls? Are they inclusive of youth? Are they inclusive of the disabled? And that's very context driven, just as Louise said. So it is an issue. I mean, it's happening, but in terms of guiding it, again, this is why this, I know I'm a lawyer, so I keep repeating this, but this sort of policy and legal framework to guide these kinds of decision-making processes and ensure the inclusive nature of them is really a critical baseline that we don't have in Zimbabwe that would really be useful. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead, Barbara. Yeah. Oh, or
very
Louise, I'm saying spot on, Jess. I totally agree with that. Thanks.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, very briefly, the community-based water tenure. That is how communities have survived since time immemorial by dealing with the climate variability and how to deal with drought. Basically, how to store water when there is enough in the wet season, in the ground or otherwise, and how to use it in the dry season. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I would just sort of, another thing that just sort of popped into my mind is the fact that within the existing legal framework, there is a possibility of the government stepping in and creating a groundwater shortage area. And that does not require community participation to make that decision. So there are a lot of existing mechanisms that are very top down and centralized to respond and adapt to these things that don't take the community perspective into account. And again, this fragmentation across these levels where, even if the catchment councils are trying to engage to see what the priorities are at the lower level, they're really accountable upward to the water agency. And so they're watching this, and the decisions to get made about, who gets cut off. There's literally no consultation or even access to information for these communities to understand when it's coming, and how it's going to be implemented.
Oh, yeah. I think we had another great question about elaborating on the challenges stemming from policy frameworks and regulations and those other kinds of governance factors. And I think you've really nailed it with that, Jess. We have a question from Matt Stelbauer, and I'm wondering if we can put you on the spot and have you come off mute and come on camera and explain your question about the community systems and the 3 subtypes. With the question being, did any of these 3 subtypes exist in our community, in the communities that were researched, and did they figure in the study, being the single access or systems with distribution networks or systems with networks to individual homesteads? But just to flag which question we're talking about. Matt, if you're still with us, would you like to come off mute and... Oh, he may not be. He may have left. Okay, so the question was, did you only consider the domestic and irrigation plus system, or did you also consider the community-based systems and its 3 subcategories, being the single access point systems, systems with distribution networks to a common standpipes, and systems with distribution networks to individual homesteads? And did any of these 3 subtypes exist in the communities, and did they figure in the study? I think that could be a quick answer. Jess, maybe? Yeah, go ahead, Jess.
Yeah. So I think this actually is interesting because it's reflective of sort of a larger issue around moose generally, that we define it differently in different contexts. So these 3 subcategories were not the way in which we kind of approached how we were going to differentiate projects, because in the Zimbabwean context, the irrigation plus domestic plus community driven sort of made more sense from a framework, because that's sort of the approach that was taken. In terms of the actual infrastructure, that those three categories reflect, yes. I mean, I would say, what were the, I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me, the three categories. I mean, I know we did have distribution networks on site at some of the irrigation schemes that were added on. There were definitely single point systems. In terms of our reticulation to homesteads, I'm sure there are examples of that, but I have not, they were not in our projects that I saw. Barbara, yeah, maybe I missed one. And Evaristo too, can maybe jump in here. He was out in the field.
Yeah, just from our research also in Nepal, PhDs done, etc. The site of use becomes very important. If it is around homestead, it's now 90% is multiple use. If it is a distant area, an isolated plot, it may be that there is one borehole row pump near a field, then it would be only used for that. So, and that is the community perspective, very much. Then the site of use is so important, and the multiple uses and the multiple sources, etc. The categories can be also from the professionals, the external agencies, support agencies. They think it's domestic. They think it's irrigation. They may have, we do this, we do that. But yeah, so bottom up, the side of use is the most important.
Thanks for that. That's great. We only have a couple minutes left. I do want to spare a moment to just point out that any questions we don't get to, please keep the link for the Google Doc that you guys have been contributing to, and we can provide full answers there on that doc over the next day or so. And we'll also be adding a link to the PowerPoint presentation and the research study to that doc so that you'll have easy access to those links. And you can also sign up for our newsletter if you indicate that you're interested. And the website will be provided for signing up. There may be time for one quick question about making sure that people are involved from the community for sustainability once an international organization has established a multi-use system. What are the ways for such involvement of local communities or local water organizations? Any quick answers?
Sure, I think Jude and myself could answer that one. With regards to water quality, this is certainly possible. We can train users on how to repair and maintain these particular water systems that are there. So the other part of the question is asking about the possibility of repair and maintenance of treatment systems within an MUS. So we're saying, yes, we do have inline UV filtration. We do have systems with inline chlorination. This is possible, but beyond the life of the project, this will be difficult. It boils down to what Jess spoke around about MUS financing. So if communities can finance these, definitely partners, governments can always train users. So over to you, Jude. I don't know if you have anything further.
I think you summed it up really well there, Louise. Thank you. I know we're pretty much out of time. I'll hand back to Jen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's been great. I want to thank our presenters, Jess, Barbara, and Louise. It's been fantastic having you all with us, and please stay in touch. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the World Water Week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.